been. So, all right, James chapter 1 is where we are. We don't have a problem in our culture with knowledge in our world. Knowledge is exploding at every possible corner. I'm told that every 60 seconds, another 2,000 pages are published. And I'm sure that number is probably dated by where I found that information. It's even more. Now, I'm told then also that if you were to read 24 hours a day from the age of 21 to the age of 70, by the time you got to the age of 70, you would be behind 1.5 million years worth of reading just to keep up with the information that is being published on a regular basis. It's safe to say this, that we devour data, but we are malnourished when it comes to wisdom. We know more about the world that we know more about the world that we live in, and yet it seems like we know less how to live in it. But we know more about this world, and James is concerned about this. James is concerned about biblical wisdom, but he's specifically concerned about biblical wisdom when it comes to trials that we live in. So not just biblical wisdom generically, but biblical wisdom for trials specifically. I'm going to show you maybe two different illustrations this morning. Trials have three dimensions, and I made this up, right? So there's nothing scientific, and this has not been peer-reviewed by anybody, all right? It's been peer-reviewed by me and my computer and the spell check. That's about it, all right? But this trials exists, I think, of at least three components or three dimensions, and the first one is just this. It's unbearable pain. And when you combine unbearable pain for a short period of time, a broken pinky, you can kind of get over it. But when you combine unbearable pain with an undefined time, that is that there's no ending date, that's when you start moving into trials, because you're wondering, this pain combined with undefined time, how long is this going to last? And then the third dimension of a trial is this: it's uncharted territory. That's part of what makes it a trial. Like, I don't understand what's going on. I don't have experience in this field. Right? For those of you who know cars, if your car starts making a sound while you're driving, you can open up the hood and tinker with it, and it's not really that much of a trial for you. It may be trial and error, but eventually you'll get to the problem to get it fixed. But for those of us who have no clue, it's like, oh no, when am I going to fit this into my schedule? How long is this going to last? When will I get my car back, right? This is what these three dimensions of pain, undefined time, and uncharted territory, when you bring these together, it's in this space right here that James takes this text and he's addressing us. So if you have one of the three or all three of the three, James has a word for you this morning. And basically it is this, is that trials demand wisdom. I took this same Venn diagram and pulled it out into a little bit more detail. And again, this has not been peer-reviewed, but I've got physical trials, financial trials, and relational trials, and you could probably have more circles in there than that, certainly. But what often happens is that the spiritual and emotional trials oftentimes arise out of other trials that we're experiencing. So the financial trouble. God, I'm praying for a raise. I'm praying for more money, right? And there's always more month than there is money. That has an impact on our faith. Or if you have an ongoing kind of emotional, like anxiety is just something that you constantly struggle with, eventually, that over time, that actually doesn't just play into your emotions, it actually shifts over into the spiritual as well. And what James is doing is he's speaking into an area of our life that you can't see, but everybody in this room immediately feels it. If the trial is physical, the question is, right, do I seek another opinion? Do I pursue this treatment? If the trial is financial, it's what expense do I cut? If I cut this, then do I need to cut this over here? Or which bill do I pay first? If the trial is relational, it's, how do I pursue a troubled relationship with a spouse? Or how do I pursue a troubled relationship with a family member? And every trial has an emotional or spiritual component to it. In fact, we at times, right, anxiety, depression, they can actually become soul-level trials where they get their own big circle that seems to occupy every other area of our life. So I've titled our message this morning, Trials Demand Wisdom. And James counsels his readers with the 3 C's of wisdom. My main points this morning are just simply this: the command for wisdom, the condition for wisdom, and a caution for wisdom. I want us to give you the first C of wisdom, and that is this, the command for wisdom, and it is this: ask God. Now, when you're reading James chapter 1, what you may find, especially when you read the first 11 to 12 verses or so, it's like kind of a buffet of Bible truths. But you're wondering, do the buffet of Bible truths, do they have any connectivity to each other? And they certainly do. This first wisdom, this command of ask of God, verse 4 is connected to verse 5 because look how verse 4 ends. He says, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking, I circled that word, lacking in nothing, and I circled it and connected to the next word, lack, in verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom. So what we're lacking oftentimes in the trial itself is this: we're lacking wisdom. He says, let him ask God. The command for wisdom is this, while we're in the midst of trials, is ask God. That trials are perplexing. We haven't had prior experience in these before. Do you know what James believes that our biggest need is not for the trial to be done or for the trial to be over. Right? That if I'm writing my book of James, I get to call it the book of Joel. I'm saying the trial needs to be done, verse 1, letter, 1a, period, end of story. But James says, no. What you need is not for the trial to be over. What you need is wisdom in the trial. This is what what is wisdom then? Wisdom is more than knowledge. It's not just that you're lacking knowledge. In fact, I told my wife, I think last Sunday when I got done preaching, I have no lack of knowledge. I got more knowledge than what I need. I have a problem with obedience, with what the Bible is telling me to do. Wisdom is more than knowledge, friends. That wisdom is the practical application of Bible truth to everyday life. That is, if Bible principles are kind of individual threads on a spool that are threaded into a shirt, wisdom is the knowledge or the ability to take those Bible truths and put those threads into a garment, into a shirt itself. One of our biggest hurdles to wisdom is that we don't know what we don't know. Right? And if you're a teacher in here, one of your jobs is to create enough curiosity, intellectual curiosity, that they go, oh, like that would be helpful if I knew that. Give me that info. One of the biggest hurdles to wisdom, not knowledge, to wisdom is we don't know what we don't know. Have you ever been around a friend who reads books all the time, and they give you a book and they're like, you need to read this book? And you're thinking to yourself, you've recommended 17 books to me and I still haven't read one, right? You got friends like that? And what happens then is they give you a book and that you set it off to the side, and then maybe a period of time down the road, you actually pick up that book and you begin to read the first chapter. And oh my, as you read that first chapter, you're like, this is incredible. They were right. And you're hooked. And oftentimes, it's not that the topic of information is that different, whether it's on parenting or on marriage or on dating or on, maybe furthering yourself in your work career. Maybe the topic isn't that brand new to you, but the way that the author presents the information is that's mind-blowing. Wisdom is like that. It's not until that you begin to access wisdom and apply it to life that you're like, oh my, I had no idea that this is what God was teaching me through the scriptures in this, and that you can go through life, and it's not until you gain wisdom that you realize what you've been missing. So if you have been amassing to yourself more and more knowledge, thinking that was the problem, may I recommend to you that actually may not be the problem. That the real problem is you take the knowledge that you already have and begin to apply it appropriately in your lives. James says this, if you want knowledge, go to school. But if you want wisdom, get on your knees. Pray. It's a command. He says, let him ask God. Right? It's an imperative. Let him, do this. Ask God. That God is if you want wisdom, there's only one place you can get it. In fact, you don't even have to have, believe it or not, you can be 21 and have more wisdom than someone who's 71. Because you have gotten on your knees and asked God for wisdom for your life. James says this, no prayer, no wisdom. And this God, he dispenses wisdom generously. That's what he says. Look at verse 5 again. If any of you lacks wisdom for this trial, let him ask God, who gives generously to all and without reproach. The word generous means to stretch out. It pictures, the idea is this, it pictures God stretching or spreading out his wisdom on a table. In fact, Proverbs 9 interestingly illustrates this very picture. It reads this way in Proverbs chapter 9, the verses will be behind me. Solomon writes, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She's getting ready for a feast. She sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine that I have mixed. Wisdom is personified in the book of Proverbs, and Solomon, as he's writing, says this to the simple. Just as the strange woman speaks to the simple and says, hey, come in here, wisdom also sends out her emissaries and says, no, if you're simple, come here. I've spread a feast of wisdom out before you. Come eat whenever you want. And I think James, who would have grown up on the Old Testament, may possibly have had that very picture from Proverbs 9 in his mind. In other words, anytime you are hungry for wisdom, you can go to a banquet table that is overflowing with it, and you can eat of wisdom until you can't eat anymore. This is the idea of generosity or of liberality, that God gives wisdom, and he does so without reproach. What does that mean, that God gives wisdom without reproach? James says this, no worries. You can come to God, and he's not going to say to you, come on, seriously? Like you didn't know what to do? Like you've been a follower of mine now for 17 years, and you're asking for wisdom about that? Friends, your God does not shame you when you come to him for wisdom. He will not rebuke you saying, well, if you had only read your Bible every day, like I told you to for the past 3 years, you would have had this figured out. Friends, that's not your God. Your God does not shame like that. Your God does not rebuke like that at all. James says, he gives it to us without reproach, without rebuke. The first C of wisdom, the first C of wisdom is the command to ask God. The second C that James gives to us is this condition of wisdom, and it is simply this, to ask in faith. Look at verse 6, the very first line of verse 6 says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. I'll be honest, verses 6 through 8 are some of the most difficult verses that I'm going to preach, I think, and I'm sure I'll get into more as we get through James, because it's a challenge, and we'll see why here in a second. But he says, let him ask in faith with no doubting. Friends, do we understand this, that faith is not a single act that happens only at the moment of salvation? Yes, the Christian teaching is this, is that in order for a person to come to God, they come through Jesus by faith, and that by going to God by faith, that God gives to them his righteousness in exchange for their sins. There's an exchange that goes on. But faith does not stop at the moment of salvation. That faith is our daily posture toward God. Faith is saying, I can't do this. Faith is a posture of humility saying, God, I need you to do something for me that I cannot do on my own. Faith is the confident conviction that you and I have that God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he promised to do. That is what faith is. He is who he says he is, and he'll do what he promised to do. Now look at the very last half of verse 6. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. We'll get into that in a moment here. He says, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. These words, I don't know how they do for you, but they cause mental anguish for every child of God. Who among us has never doubted? In fact, you can be in the same prayer, praying one portion of the prayer by faith, and literally get to the next sentence within the same paragraph, and you're doubting. Am I the only one who's had this experience? Right? So what he's likening doubt to wind-tossed waves. So we need to understand what is doubting here, and what I'm going to suggest is this: that this doubting is not speaking of an event or an event or a moment of doubt, but it is a life that is characterized more by doubt than by faith. You say, how do you arrive at that conclusion? Are you just filling that definition in for us because it sounds good? How did you arrive at that conclusion that we're not talking about single momentary just kind of doubt in the moment, and that you're actually saying that it's more about a life that is doubting and not given to faith? How did you arrive at that conclusion, Mosier? Well, I'm in James 1, so turn to Romans chapter 4. In Romans chapter 4, Paul addresses this very situation. I want to show you someone who doubted, and we would even say wavered, whom God uses tremendously. Let me give you the background of the story. He's 75 years old. His name is Abraham. He's going to be the father of a new nation. The problem is that he and his wife are childless. It's pretty hard to be the father of a nation when you got no kids to carry on your line, your name. And an angel comes to Abraham and Sarah and says to them, God sends a messenger to tell Abraham that he's going to be the father of a great nation, and his descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky. They don't even have the baby room set up, right? They haven't set up the baby list at Target yet. Nothing has gone on yet. And Sarah immediately laughs to herself, right? Not because she just sold all the baby equipment she had, but that wasn't even on her radar. Sarah laughs in unbelief. And you say, well, at least Abraham didn't laugh. No, Abraham did something even worse. Do you know what the story of Abraham? Abraham's part of the story is this, is that he took Sarah's servant, has a child by her, and says, see, that's going to be the next that's going to be the part of the nation that's going to give us the stars in the sky, so to speak. And he has Ishmael by Sarah's servant, Hagar. He has a son, all right, but it's through Sarah's servant. But underneath the inspiration of the Holy Spirit of God, here's what Paul writes. I'm in Romans 4. Look at verse 18. In Romans 4, verse 18, it says this: in hope he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told, so shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old. So the angel came to Abraham and Sarah at the age of 75. Sarah did not give birth to Isaac until Abraham was 99 years old. So it wasn't until 25 years later. Look back down to verse 19. Since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And I'm shouting at Paul as he's writing this. Paul, do you not know the story about Ishmael? You not know that Abraham took Hagar, Sarah's servant? Do you not know this story? In fact, Abraham gets thrown into Hebrews chapter 11 in that passage that we know as the Hall of Faith. So here's what I'm thinking, right? The whole time as I'm reading, I'm going back to James 1. The whole time I'm reading James 1, I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this my lot in life that I will never have any other prayers for the remainder of my life not answered because I doubt? And are there any examples that would give me any type of a glimmer of hope from God himself that God can take doubting people and have their prayers answered? And if so, what in the world do I do with a passage like this? Part of what I do with a passage like this is to understand that when James is talking about doubting and wavering, he's not talking about something that happens in the moment. He's talking about something that where a person's life is characterized by this doubting. You can say, well, I'm 47 years old and I got saved at the age of 17, and for the past 30 years, there's been a lot of doubting. But what James is getting at is not so much that there's been one doubt here at age 17, another doubt at 19, and you can kind of trace these various moments of doubt, but where is the scope of your life heading? Where is the faith anchored in? To whom is it anchored? I'm going to come back to this idea in just a moment. But I need to expand out this idea of this double or this waving faith or doubting faith, because in verses 7 through 8, James is going to expand on it. And so here's the third C of wisdom for trials, and it is this: the caution for wisdom, which is to be single-souled. The caution for wisdom is to be single-souled. These verses are a greater explanation. So let's look at verses 7 and 8, where it reads this way: for that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. That is the person who doubts. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. James says that the person who is doubting, who's like the wave of the sea, verse 7, that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. The caution here is this: brothers and sisters, be single-souled. Don't be double-minded. Pastor James what he's doing is this: he's gathering his Christian church, right? They're all scattered. There's some on the island of Cyprus. There's some up in Antioch, Phoenicia, and he's saying to this scattered church, I want you to be careful that you do not become double-souled. That's the idea of double-minded. Don't become two souls. Become single-minded, single-souled. James is saying this: it is the idea of competing allegiances, of spiritual schizophrenia. James is saying to his congregation, you have found safety from persecution for your family, right? Now, I want you to gather with other believers and serve your God. You have found security in your new town. As you set up your new business, I want you to pursue Jesus as hard as you are starting your new business. This is going to come together here in a moment, all right? So stick with me. He's saying to his church who is dispersed, be single-souled. Be more Christian than you are American. Okay, let me go into application. Give your allegiances, for us now, give your allegiances to Jesus above your political party. That is, if your politician says A, but Jesus says B, go with Jesus. Declare to your family that Jesus' kingdom and his priorities take first place by arranging your schedule around the gathered worship for Christ's people. Declare to your soul and your finances that walking by faith, what is walking by faith? Living on 90% is more important than keeping 100%. That is, when I tithe, it is a way of announcing to my soul, my heart, and my mind, Jesus will take care of all of my needs. And I need that reminder. I get paid every other week. I actually need that reminder more than every other week. See, when you get paid, you have the opportunity to shout to your soul that as you tithe this, that Jesus is King of my life. And what James is saying here, right, as the servant of God, no man gets to serve two masters. And that we are given opportunities every day of our lives, multiple times a day, to declare that we are not a double-souled, double-minded people. That we, as followers of Jesus, we are a single-souled, eye toward Jesus type of people. And even the various illustrations that I gave there by way of application, even there, right, we kind of tinge at those. Why? Because we know instinctively that that's a struggle in our soul. That we're not single-souled, that we're not single-eyed toward Jesus. So what does a middle schooler or a high schooler seek who is single-souled? What does a single-souled adult value? And the answer to each of those two questions is Jesus, which automatically eliminates certainly that which is evil, certainly that which is sinful, or even that which is good, is if it competes with Jesus. So what do we do then with these dreadful warnings, right? These dreadful warnings of no doubting, driven, tossed by the wind. That person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. What are we supposed to do with these things, these warnings like this? I struggled with this. I want to give you an illustration here. And so I had to borrow one of my kids' fishing poles, okay? So let me grab this here. All right. So those of you who are like real fishermen, I don't know. Don't judge me by my... It's from Academy, on my fishing pole, all right? James, and if you're looking at the whole pole, the bobber is what we're going to focus on here for a moment. Does your faith look and feel a lot like this fishing bobber? You ever gone fishing and that wind is going and your bobber's going up and down and kind of being tossed back and forth? When I'm reading James chapter 1, talking about faith that's being pushed back and forth, that's what I'm thinking. Like, that's Mosier. And James even says earlier in verse 2, that trials actually pull our faith. They test our faith. Is your faith more like a fishing bobber or more like an anchor? And most of us would say, well, my faith is more like a fishing bobber. And I think this is where we can become confused about James chapter 1, that if we view our faith as that bobber going up and down, these very phrases kind of become self-fulfilling prophecies, that I will never receive anything from the Lord. But folks, what is our faith in as we're reading James 1? Our faith is not in our faith. If this bobber is a picture of our faith, and we're seeing it bounce back and forth across the sea or across the pond in my neighborhood, our faith is not in the bobber. Our faith is not in the faith itself. Where is faith supposed to be located? What is the object of our faith? The object of our faith is Christ. James actually says that, yes, trials will push you back and forth. That's one of the purposes of trials. But our faith has never been in how solid our faith is in and of itself. Our faith has always been in an object. So I'm in James 1. Go back 6 chapters to Hebrews chapter 6, and let's see if we can wrap this up here. Hebrews chapter 6, where we read this in verse 13. The author of Hebrews says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained a promise, for people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. We have this sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope. But not just any hope, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Wait a second. I didn't know hope had legs. I didn't know hope was embodied. But the author of Hebrews says this, that hope, the hope is our sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, and that it actually enters into the inner place behind the curtain. What is the inner place behind the curtain? We're talking about the temple where the high priest would enter once a year. Verse 20, hope is identified where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on whose behalf? Having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Our sure and steadfast anchor is our hope. But this anchor is not some unknown inanimate object, that our hope enters into this inner place behind the curtain. Our hope is Jesus. Our faith is anchored in Jesus. He's the one who tore the curtain in two. He's the one who entered into the holy place. He is the eternal priest who ever lives to intercede for us. Our faith then rests in Him. So our eyes are not looking at that bobber going up and down saying, see, I told you that I'm the doubting person who waves back and forth like the waves of the sea. No, our eyes are focused not on that faith called the bobber. Our eyes are focused on Jesus who enters into the holiest place of all. I want to close with this and go to Hebrews chapter 12. Let me finish with this. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 reads this way, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Where are we looking? To Jesus, the founder. I got that, right? And I often think that I'm the perfecter, but the text says, who's the perfecter of our faith? Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Friends, as you look at James chapter 1, your job is not to become so introspective about whether or not you are doubting. What you are challenged to do is, like Peter, is to get your eyes off of the waves as you stand on the waters and to look at the risen and ascended Christ who is there for you. So I hope that the Spirit of God, rather than allowing James 1 verses 5 through 8 to be like an anchor that sinks you even deeper into the water and puts you more in misery, that actually what James chapter 1 verses 5 through 8 is lightens that load and says this, your faith, brother and sister, is not in your faith. Your faith is anchored into the hope who is Christ. And based upon that, you have the assurance that God will give you wisdom for the trials that you are experiencing. Let's pray.